housing law, all the changes that are happening, how can you overcome the challenges, and how can you make property investing work for you. Joining me today is Archie Maddan, a very experienced barrister. Welcome, Archie.
Hi, hello.
Hi, so we've got Archie here. I'm Dovedi from HMO Property, and we thought we'd share this short video with you, about all the different things that are actually happening in the property world when it comes to changes. So, Archie, really a great privilege to have someone of your caliber here, very experienced. How long have you been doing this? How long have you been in the world of law?
Well, I've been in practice for over 20 years.
20 years.
And mostly at the bar, although I did 5 years working for a local authority in London, which gave me an insight into the way that local councils go about their business. But really for about the last 15 or so years I've been back in private practice and increasingly specialising in housing and regulatory work, and in particular houses in multiple occupation, which obviously now becoming an increasingly important element of the private rented sector. And I think most of us at some time in our lives will live in an HMO, whether as a student or as a young professional, or increasingly some people through financial necessity are finding that it forms a large part of their life will be spent living in HMOs. So it's a very important part of our housing stock now in the UK.
For the people that are listening in and watching this video right now, what would you say to somebody who's just starting out in property when it comes to all the different challenges that are out there in terms of the changes that are happening in legislation and housing law? Someone getting started, what would be one of your sort of key points, would you say, for them to be aware of when it comes to housing law in property?
Well, I think the first thing to realise is that it's increasingly going to be regulated. So the first thing is not to run away from the regulation, but to accept it as a fact of life, and it's not going to go away. And I think to plan for it and to factor it into the way that you plan to run your investment or your portfolio or whatever it is, to factor in the need to deal with regulators, with the local authority officers, to be aware of it, and to factor it in also obviously into your time and your budget in terms of the way you're going to manage your property.
So agree with what Archie is saying here. So really that awareness is so key. There's so many property investors out there who don't really know what they're getting into. So clearly, they need the information. So you're listening in here. So just think about these things. So be aware of your property strategy. Now, being a property investor, investing for over 2 decades now, we have a number of different strategies that work in property. One of them is buy-to-lets. We also have HMOs, which we're going to come on to, and many other strategies such as permitted development and developments and so on. So just focusing on the investment side of it for someone starting in, let's say buy-to-lets. So let's talk about buy-to-lets. So in terms of buy-to-lets, what kind of legislation do you think you're seeing coming in for buy-to-let types of investments, family homes, one unit, where an easy in for an investor to cut the teeth and actually get into the investment world? What's the awareness that you think they should be, or what should they be aware of right now?
Well, I think the first one obviously is the tax changes, and you're much more of an expert on that than I am, because you're effectively an investment manager and I'm merely a humble lawyer. But we're all aware, I think, that there's been a quite substantial change in the tax treatment, and the crucial change has been the tapering off of the ability to offset income against mortgage payments. And I think that this was probably inevitably coming, because with the ending of mortgage interest tax relief for owner-occupiers a long time ago, increasingly there was political pressure to sort of tip the scales back in a more equal fashion. And that, of course, has had an effect that property investors and landlords and buy-to-let landlords have lost out. So the first thing to be aware of is the tax changes, and that's not going to change. And I know that this is having an impact, and I imagine that you're seeing it quite a lot in the industry, are you not?
Yeah, so Archie's absolutely right. So there's changes in terms of taxation. Now, I'm not a tax expert. I'm not going to give you tax advice, but what I can bring is the entrepreneur's angle, the investor's angle, and I'm very lucky that I have really good people, senior barristers, tax experts, all different types of people in the property world that, and you can build your team in the same way. So, we have a whole way of dealing with these changes in terms of taxation. That's a conversation to have another time, but be rest assured there are ways that you can implement which are absolutely the correct way of doing things. In terms of your...
I was going to say, in terms of perhaps more my field, the local authority in your area will always be willing and able to provide information, either on their websites or many of them have training sessions that they organise for local landlords in their borough, and they often will be able also sometimes to take telephone inquiries or even meetings. It's a cooperative process, so the first thing I would say is if you're buying a piece of property as an investment, always check to see whether that local area has a licensing scheme, and if it does have one, then make sure you get licensed and don't rent the property out until you've got the right license. And if in doubt, ask. Go and ask the local authority. Make them your friends rather than becoming their enemy.
Some really good advice here. So let's think about this. So let's think about it as an investor's perspective. So your business people, your entrepreneurs, and if you're looking to get into properties and you're looking, let's say, to go into the buy-to-let strategy, which is what we're talking about right now, be aware of the licensing that is out there, exactly what Archie is saying. And as Archie is saying, you can find that on the websites. Now, if you think about it, the councils, what they're doing is, to an extent, it's really a common sense approach, because what they're looking for is good landlords, people like you who want to be investing in property correctly, making money, and that's absolutely fine. You have a business, but they just want to make sure that the housing stock that they have, the people that are actually providing this service are at a competent professional, working at a competent professional level. So what does that actually mean? Well, like I say, it's pretty much common sense. I mean, the licensing, literally, there may be a fee for it. Typically, we invest in London, we invest in some of these areas that Archie's mentioning, we also invest in the Midlands. So we've actually got 3 specific niche areas, and each of these areas has some of the selective licensing coming in. So yes, first of all, is to be aware of what that entails. So typically what that means is it's usually a fee of around £500, depending on the borough, depending on the council. So you pay your £500. There is some form filling to do. You need to be a fit and proper person. That's usually another requirement. And when it comes to the property, it's usually the case that the property is adequate for someone to actually live in and treat it like a home. Now, if you really think about it, that's kind of common sense, isn't it? It's a common sense approach. So if you're providing reasonable, good accommodation, clean, where everything is functioning, it's a functional property, to your tenants, then you're going to be fine. Now, what we're noticing in some of these areas, when it comes to selective licensing, the council can actually come along, they can check the property if it needs a refurbishment, and it's really good. What we do is we get them in early. So before we do any refurbishment on a tired property, we'll get the council in the areas where there's selective licensing, we'll get the officer to actually walk around with us, and they're pretty decent people. They'll walk around, they're amicable, and they'll walk around and they'll say, actually, this part of the property is changing. There might be some damp in a certain corner of the property, which you can rectify. Might be some minor changes that you need to do, such as, let's say there's for example, a carbon monoxide, which is mandatory, detector is needed, or there's a window that's broken that needs fixing. Again, the common sense approach. So they're really pointing out, the sort of common factors that you do anyway, and that's what they're asking for. They're asking for good people like you to be investing in property and just making sure that they're looking after the tenants and giving them a good property. So that's kind of as the investor perspective, looking at it on a buy to let level strategy. These are the things that you can do. So it's all doable. It's all doable. So let's talk about HMOs, Archie. So we're moving on to another strategy. Yeah. A little bit deeper, more legislation. So tell us more about this. What are your thoughts around that?
Well, first of all, for any of the viewers who are a bit confused by the term, HMO simply stands for House in Multiple Occupation. And what that means is you've got more than one household. And a household is defined as either a family with people in a relationship or blood family. The classic example of an HMO would, of course, be a student house, a shared student house, and many of us will have lived in one. Or the classic young professionals sharing a flat when they first get their first job and move to the big city or whatever. That is the classic house in multiple occupation.
Sure.
And it's unrelated people who are not in a relationship and are not members of the same family, but sharing a house. And that's the legal definition. And the reason why that matters is a lot of landlords are attracted to HMOs because they can frankly get more rent. The yield is greater. You get more lettings, each room can be let, and so they're a lot more profitable. But HMOs present their own problems in terms of the condition of the premises. And so increasingly we've had more and more regulation. And the regulation for houses in multiple occupation is quite different from that for other residential properties.
Okay, so just to clarify, so when we're talking about, and just for the viewers that are listening in, so when we're talking about unrelated people, how many are we actually talking about? So how many people becomes?
Well, I mean, strictly speaking, any property where you've got any unrelated people living in it as their home is probably a house in multiple occupation within the legal test. And one of the mistakes that's made is a lot of people confuse the licensing threshold, which is when a house in multiple occupation requires to have a license from the local authority, with whether it's an HMO or not. You can get HMOs which are small, which don't require a license, but they're still HMOs, and that's important because that means that the entire regulatory framework of condition management regulations, as we call them, applies. And a lot of people that one comes across make the mistake of thinking, oh, well, because it doesn't need a license, because it doesn't have 5 or more people living in 2 separate households, which is the threshold test for a license, that somehow none of the management regulations apply.
Okay, so that's good to know, right? So you're aware now, we're aware of the fact that there's obligations there. So let's talk about these obligations. So of course, there's councils all up and down the country, but if you could think about some of the mandatory obligations that that you can share with our viewers and listeners, well, what would those be, the key ones?
Well, the starting point is whether the property requires a license or not. Now, we've already touched on that. Now, there is a threshold test that any house in multiple occupation which has 5 or more people living as more than 2 households automatically requires a license anywhere in England. And that's non-negotiable, and you will simply have to then go and see the local authority and start the license application procedure. As we touched on earlier, local authorities have the ability to bring in additional licensing requirements within certain parts of their borough where they feel it's necessary to address specific issues. And that can be by way of what's called additional licensing. Now, the next set of things to bear in mind,
yes,
as I say, is the management regulations. Now, these are, as I say, quite specific for houses in multiple occupation. There are various sets of them depending on the type of HMO you've got. And I don't want to get too technical about it, but the type of things they cover are, as you've said, the condition of the property and the maintenance, particularly the common parts, which always become a bone of contention, but are in fact always the responsibility of the landlord, even when the property is occupied. It's not like a rented family home where the family have the obligation to sort of keep it clean. I mean, in fact, the common parts, the shared parts, which the people in the house in multiple occupation use, even the cleaning of that is down to the landlord. The garden, it remains the responsibility of the landlord or the agent. And of more importance, and really perhaps the most important concern, is fire safety. But it is important that HMO landlords are aware of this set of obligations and that they build it into whatever plan they may have.
Absolutely. So let's think about these things. Now, often, I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes you listen in on these things and sometimes they sound quite complicated. But actually, when you come to the crux of it, and when you actually go to do it as an investor, you find it's not really, it's quite easy actually. It's not really that difficult. So let's talk about these things. So for example, things like, in our HMOs, fire doors. Yeah, absolutely. So let's pick that one specifically. A fire door with an intermittent strip, painted correctly with the right type of paint, not just gloss paint, right type of fire paint, retardant paint, with a door closer, making sure it's got the right lock on it with the thumbnail. All of that. Typically, we're looking at an expenditure of anything between £150 to £200, depending where you are in the country. So it's not actually really rocket science. You know, it's all doable. It's just being aware and having the people who can share the information with you on how to do it is what I found. So it's all doable. It's literally giving a brief. So the way we do it is we'll check the legislation, we'll check online, we'll have the authority come around and have a look as well. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they'll just tell you over the phone, say, look, you know, that's fine. You're right. You're in the right parameters. That's all you need to do. You create the brief. You give it to your refurbishment team. This is what we require. We require these types of fire doors. We want these types of smoke alarms in each of these rooms. These are the fire regulations required for this authority. This is what we want. And you simply hand that brief to your refurbishment crew who can actually give you a price for that, implement it, job done. So if you really think about it, it's quite easy to do.
It is.
And it's really good to be aware that you're doing the right thing. So it's good that we're sharing this. Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, obviously as someone who advises landlords and also someone who advises local authorities, I would always urge people to do the right thing.
Yes.
There are other considerations as well, moving on from that.
Yeah, sure.
I know that one of the issues which has become to the fore recently is room size.
Room sizes, and you might have heard about this, you know, changing of room sizes. Quite a lot of investors with HMOs, you know, having to change those units back into single dwellings simply because the room sizes aren't working. So I'm very interested to hear from yourself, Archie. You know, what are your thoughts about these room sizes? What are you finding?
Well, the first thing to say is that the government announced at the beginning of the year that following consultation, it had decided that there will now be national minimum room size regulations for HMOs. We haven't seen the actual regulations yet. I think we're expecting them to be published in the spring, but the government has said that they will, as I think we expected, they will bring minimum room size rules in. And the effect of this will mean that if you've got a bedroom which you're planning to rent out in a house in multiple occupation, it's got to be above a certain size, depending on the number of occupants that you're planning to rent it to. So for one adult, for example, the minimum room size is going to be 6.51 square metres. There is a historical reason for why that rather peculiar figure has been come about, but I won't go into the myths of time and the various histories of bits of legislation over the last 80 years which have led to that. But that is going to be the national minimum standard.
I'm curious. Would you like to share that? Would you like to share why that is? Why is it 6.5? I get the fact
that it's lost in the midst of time. I believe it's because it's the old 80 square foot, which was the old. It's the old. It still is actually the yardstick for overcrowding,
right.
Which I believe I'm right in saying goes right back to the 1936 Public Health Act, but to do with issues of overcrowding.
Okay.
And it's been adopted as a sort of working yardstick, and now it's going to be put into legislative force. And there is a scale going upwards. So for a double occupancy room, it'll be a larger size again. Now the key thing to say about this is that up until now, we've never had mandatory minimum room sizes. But what we have had is local authorities giving guidance for their own areas. And in most cases, that guidance is that they will not grant a license for a room of a certain size. Now it varies. Different borough councils seem to have quite different room size guidance, but they're all larger than 6.51.
That's a really good point.
And so it's going to be a floor below which no HMO bedrooms are going to be able to fall. But bear in mind that if you're operating in a particular area, do check to see what the local guidance is. Now, we don't quite yet know, any of us, how this will pan out, but it is possible that local authorities will stick to their own preferred local minimum room size. So it might be 8 or 10 square metres for a single occupancy bedroom. But the national mandatory minimum room size will be 6.51. In theory, it will be possible for landlords to appeal the decision, or say a refusal by a local authority to license a room, and they will try and chase it down to 6.51. My suspicion is that the tribunals, if they have to deal with these type of appeals, will tend to want to support the local authorities. So it's going to be a bit of a muddle to begin with, but one thing which one can certainly say is if you've got a house in multiple occupation and you've got a single bedroom and it's less than 6.5 square metres in size, you are going to have to rethink whether you can let that room. Don't underestimate the power of your tape measure. Go and measure your rooms and make sure that you're in line with what is going to be binding national standards, which we expect to have sometime in the spring.
Absolutely. So it's good to know that we're with the barrister who's a bit of a trendsetter as well at the same time. So, checking in with all these cases. And yeah, I'd agree with the 6.5 square metres. Now, before all this licensing came in, before all this legislation came in, at Premier Property, even in single units, in family households, homes, we're always looking to make sure that the bedroom is 6.5 square metres. You might notice that certain investors, what they do is they take a room and they'll chop it up into two and they'll make them into really unpractical bedrooms. Think about, again, it comes back to that common sense approach. If you've got a bedroom which is 4.5 square metres or 5 square metres, how can anybody move in there? How can actually anyone use that as a true bedroom? So, what we've always been doing is keeping the rooms to a 6.5 square metres anyway. So think about how you do business. Think about how you can future-proof your business as legislation changes, as the rules come in. How are you working? So maybe you might not be looking at HMO right now. Maybe the property that you're looking at or you're in right now, your portfolio, the room sizes, when you measure them, you make sure that they are 6.5 square metres. And later on, let's say you decide to implement the HMO strategy, you may find that you're happily surprised that you're doing the right thing in the first place. So we at Premier Property are always looking at bedrooms to be a minimum of 6.5 square metres. Sometimes we'll look at houses where, like I say, those rooms are much smaller, and we normally it's an internal partition, and we take the partition out, even be it the fact that it's a 3-bedroom house, and we'll convert it back into a 2-bedroom house. And what you'll find is actually you get a higher yield, people want to live there longer, you get lower voids, and it's a much more of a doable project for you. It's much more sustainable for you. So think about these things. So very useful. Yeah.
I think generally what we're getting, as I say, is more regulation. There's been quite a lot of discussion over the last year or so about the degree of variation between local authorities, and some local authorities are much more active in regulating the private rented sector, including HMOs. And so I think that landlords who maybe have got used to a light touch regulatory regime in their town or city should always bear in mind that things can change, and they could change quite rapidly, and you could suddenly find that you get a new change in administration, and perhaps a new council comes in and says, as part of their manifesto promises, that they will crack down on rogue landlords, is normally the phrase that the headline that's used. It's the one that's actually in the government's own briefing papers. And the penalty notices can be up to £30,000. And that's quite a big hit to take. And the ones I've seen so far coming through the system, served by some of the London boroughs, have been of the order of £20,000. So the starting point is quite high.
Okay, so let's talk about these penalty notices. So when it comes to penalty notices, before a penalty notice is issued or any litigation process starts, a landlord, people who at the moment might not know a situation that's going to arise, but it arises because the council created it. Is there a grace period? Do they have some time frame to work to before they get the penalty notice?
Right. I won't go through in detail the procedures. There is a procedure laid down in the law, which local authorities have to follow.
Sure.
And they have to serve an initial notice, and then they have to follow that through. And there is a right of appeal. It can be appealed. Well, there is a right to make representations, and then, in theory, that can be challenged. The bottom line is that it will depend. All of this enforcement work, different authorities seem to do it differently. Some boroughs, so for example I can think of Haringey, don't like to be punitive, and they will work with landlords and they'll put them on notice. They'll write to them, they'll say, we're concerned about the condition of your property, or we've had complaints and so on and so forth, and we've inspected or whatever, and we want you to put these things right. Other boroughs, for example, such as my experience in Newham, or some of the other London boroughs, or Hounslow or whatever, will be much more proactive straight away, and won't give landlords and agents warning that there's a problem and that they should put it right. They will go straight in, and up till now would go straight in and prosecute.
So do you feel that the information, making sure that investors get it right first time from the beginning, being aware of all this, do you think that's a benefit to
I think it's essential, because I think the financial implications of getting yourself on the wrong side of the regulatory system are so severe now, because if you are investigated by the local authority and they either serve a penalty notice and it's upheld if you go through the procedures, or if they prosecute you and you're found guilty, or you plead guilty in the magistrate's court, or then the fines and the legal costs can be considerable. And then in addition, they can seek in some circumstances to make what's called a rent repayment order, and they can apply to the tribunal for that to be made. And that can require the paying back of rent to either tenants or to housing benefit authorities if it's a benefit funded tenancy. So it is absolutely crucial that if you are running a piece of residential property, that you respect the regulatory environment that you are working in, that you try and cooperate with the local authority, that you make the best efforts you can to make sure that your property is completely as it should be, and then you won't hit these problems.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you've got the information, you got the right information the first time. And what I find is that getting the information right, speaking to good people like yourself who are sort of on the cutting edge of all of this, the teams that we have, that information we filter through, we train people, I help people, assist people, and it's about getting the current information, isn't it? It's about, because it's always, like you say, it's always changing. So information,
I think the other thing
crucial.
I would say, one of the other misconceptions is that landlords, particularly of HMOs, will tend to think, well, if I hand it over to an agent to manage for me, then they'll deal with it all. The problem for landlords is that doesn't protect you. You can still be liable for breaches of the regulations. And I think that choosing your agent is really important.
Choosing the agent, absolutely.
So, really do choose your advisors well.
So think about this as well when it comes to, really good points here. We're thinking about, how you can make lettings work for you. Talking about legislation. So absolutely, choose your managing agent really well. Now, what we find is there are a number of management agents, and there's quite a few of them now. They're cropping up. They're coming up where they have a specific niche. So you will find in your area that there are agents who will actually manage HMOs. And Archie's quite right. Your responsibility still lies with you. So it's one point is to actually. So there's 3 points to this. So firstly, it's about finding the right letting agent who can do the job that you require. So if it's a HMO, find a letting agent who is competent and professional, who can deal with that HMO. They're dealing with HMOs already. If it's a buy-to-let, find the agent that can deal with the buy-to-let. They might not be good at HMOs, but they will be good at the buy-to-let. So find that niche. That would be number one. Secondly, it's your responsibility. It's our responsibility as entrepreneurs and investors to make sure that we're managing the managing agent. So at Premier Property, what we do is on a monthly basis, on a quarterly basis. When the tenancy is brand new, it's on a bi-monthly basis. We're always in touch with the managing agent. We're always making sure. One of the other key points we find is about inspections. Always inspect your property. There's a lot of problems that come along because properties aren't inspected. So if you're inspecting your property every 6 months, if you're asking your managing agent to inspect that property, ask for documentation, ask for photos. If you can be in that area, if you can go along with them, that's brilliant as well. So it's down to us to make sure that we're managing this as a business, and it's all doable. It doesn't take a lot of effort. Managing your managing agent typically can be a phone call over time. Over a 6-month period, that might be one visit. So it's minimum amount of time, a minimum amount of effort. But think about these things where you're proactive in managing the managing agent when they are managing your property. So that's sort of second point. And the third point would be is really get the information. The thing about information is there's so much information that's bandied about. We've got Archie here. Clearly, very experienced man, knows what he's talking about. Over 2 decades of experience. So very humble to have you here, Archie.
No, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, I would say that.
Yeah.
In terms of that, as I say, local authorities can provide quite a lot of basic information for landlords and for tenants and anybody involved in property.
Sure.
It's available on their websites, and as I say, they often run training courses. They're quite proactive, some local authorities, certainly the ones I know of in London, in trying to get local landlords to be trained up, which even if you're using a managing agent is not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing, as you say. So it allows you to ask the right questions of your agent. So, be an informed client, so that when you're speaking to your agent or to your lawyer or to whoever is working for you, that you know the right questions to ask. So I would say that build that relationship with your agent and with your tenants if possible, obviously respecting the boundaries that exist and the roles that people have, but that try and be cooperative with everybody that you work with. I see enough confrontation in my job to know that ultimately if you can cooperate with the local authority and get a good agent, that problems will arise less often. But if you get into a confrontational relationship with the local authority or with your own tenants, then that is a recipe for considerable strife and can go badly wrong. And so I think it is a workmanlike approach that is needed in terms of doing the homework, learning a bit about what you're doing, and showing respect for the regulators, for your tenants, and picking the right agent. And following the advice of the agent sometimes as well. But you know more about that than me because you're a landlord and you have to deal with agents and tenants.
Yeah, so you mentioned some training courses, so here's some specifics for you. So NLA, the NLA will run in one-day courses. You can check in on those. The RLA, they'll also run one-day courses. At Premier Property, we also train people. We've got CPD certified courses that we have as well, which is not as operational. They're more about how you can make money the right way, the investor's perspective, all the things that you're not going to find really on the internet. It's just hard experience shared.
Yes.
So there's various things that there's lots out there that you can inform, get yourself informed. I'd suggest always keep it current because as Archie's mentioning, it's always changing. Keeping it current, what's happening right now. So just things to be aware of. So Archie, it's been wonderful. Thank you very much for your valuable time.
Thank you.
You've inspired a number of people and you've really helped them, assist them in helping become more aware. Thank you very much.
No, pleasure.